Lucas just before he jetted off on his holiday. Let's take a look.
Index behaved this year relative to previous years? We know the previous years haven't been that fantastic.
Yeah, I think probably the main underlying driver this year has been the state of international markets as a whole. They had a pretty good year, and I think that helped underpin the JSE. As far as the JSE itself goes, it's been a very deep and narrow year with, up until very recently, just a very few shares making the big running. The big rand hedges made most of the running, and only recently in the last week or so have we seen the rest of the market actually broadening out and starting to pick up its feet.
Warwick, how are you seeing the performance of the rand vis-a-vis previous years?
All right, well, it was very much a political story this year. I mean, we saw some wild volatility in around about March time when we saw the change in the finance ministry, and then from there a steady weakening through the year as downgrade became more and more the core issue. And then finally we saw a substantial recovery with the change in the presidency of the ANC, that's been the last couple of weeks, an enormous recovery there.
Now, given continued tepid economic growth for South Africa, although next year is supposed to look slightly better, what's your advice to how people should be investing their money?
Look, at this stage of the economic cycle, even though we're looking at recovery, I mean, the companies that are going to be able to make the most of it are those that are on some kind of a decent footing. So the disaster situations don't necessarily make for good recovery plays. So I think investors should focus on companies that have got cash flow, they are paying dividends, and they have management with reasonable records of integrity.
It would be true to say, would it not, that being obsessed just with offshore counters is not necessarily a wise approach?
I don't think that is going to be a particularly useful approach this year. I mean, the rand as a currency is basically undervalued, so I think there is some recovery scope there. And furthermore, I mean, the commodity cycle is still looking reasonably favourable. I think that's going to give a positive headwind to the rand. So yeah, I think a focus on offshore is frankly a bit late at this point.
Okay. Now, we know the result of the ANC elective conference. We know that Cyril Ramaphosa is now the leader of the ANC on the one side, and we have President Jacob Zuma being the state president on the other side. Are there any concerns from a market perspective about the two centres of power that we now have in terms of them pursuing policy? Are we going to have some stagnation in policy implementation, do you think?
I think we certainly are not going to see any policy regression. I mean, at this point, Cyril Ramaphosa is going to, I think, focus on internal party matters. But the one thing that's just as it was in the transition between Thabo Mbeki and Jacob Zuma was that the president of the ANC now has a very firm whip hand, and I think if nothing else, that should see off any regressive type of policy. I think if the president now acts out of line in any way, I think a recall would follow quite swiftly.
And then just one stock I want us to focus on, simply because I think it's a real lesson for South Africa and maybe the wider world. Steinhoff, we've seen the debacle that has transpired. We still don't know what this company's books actually really look like, and we've seen massive value destruction on the stock. What lessons do you think we can glean from the Steinhoff experience? Okay,
so there were a few smoke signals that puffed out of Steinhoff before things really went down. For one thing, they had a persistent decline in their asset productivity. They consistently were weak in cash flows. They continued to make acquisitions that really had very little apparent sense to them. So I guess there's a few things on a financial side to look at there, but the other side was, well, the company was never that great about taking hard, searching questions. They were very poor in either fobbing them off or other ways circumventing journalists who ask questions. And I think there is a smoking gun. I mean, there's a certain degree of transparency and integrity that's required, and that wasn't apparent there. And I think investors should hold their companies to a higher standard. The other issue, of course, is, as always, diversity. If you didn't have too many Steinhoffs, you didn't get burned too badly. And so I think investors should always remember, beware of betting the house on one company.
You had a bit of foresight and you had a bit of insight, I suppose, and that's why you steered clear of Steinhoff. But if you were speaking to colleagues in your industry, what sort of things would you be advising them at the asset management community in order to ensure that they safeguard their clients' money when they're dealing with specific companies?
I think I would go back to the point that I made about leaning on management to answer questions fully and finally. I mean, quite a few years ago, David Gleeson asked questions about the accounts, and he just continually got a runaround. And that is a real smoking gun. I think when issues like that come up, I think analysts should lean in harder and really demand those answers.